I'm Matt Booker.
And I'm Don Hough, wishing you all the best on the Concavity Show.
Oh, all right, Don, thank you so much for being here today. As you can probably tell by my solo voice, my co host, Dave, could not be here today. So he sends his regrets to you and the listeners, but he will be back very soon for another episode. But welcome, Don. It feels like not really a guest. It's like having a friend on. So
Yeah, it
I'm
feels like hanging out.
for people who haven't met you. I'm know you primarily as a fiction writer, as the author of The Funeral Girl, which is a collection of short stories, as well as two other books we're going to talk about today. One is an essay collection called The Exact Right Word, and the third book is a collection of correspondence that is brand new. I would say most people listening here have not seen this book yet. And it's called All the Best, a collection of letters. So, Don, welcome to the show. Welcome to the Concavity. I've wanted to have you on here since I read Funeral Girl. Man, what was that, 6 or 7 years ago? It's been a while.
I think you read it the year it came out, 2017, toward the end of the year.
Okay.
So, yeah,
Yeah, 6 or 7 years
you
ago.
were
I was
yeah,
right on.
you were one of the early readers of that.
And yeah, I read that book sort of, sight unseen. I knew you from Twitter and your blogger profile as, a writer, and also as like a Wallace fan in a way. But had not read any of your work until you sent me that file. And I remember reading it and thinking, wow, this is really good. And my first impression of the, the Funeral Girl, the story, the title story, was pretty gobsmacked at the language, but also at what I think were some of the Wallace influences. So I do want to ask you about some of that stuff, but let me start out and just ask you, like, let's back up before 2017 and talk about a little bit of your path to becoming a writer, your influences. Like, did you always want to be a writer, Don?
I feel like I came to it pretty late, actually. It was more toward the end of high school, kind of beginning of college, that I started seriously considering writing. I've always sort of, been a reader. I've read throughout my childhood and through high school, but it was more popular fiction, really, to be honest. Like I was reading a lot of Michael Crichton, John Grisham stuff in high school. And then the thing that really opened a few key books, I think, opened it up for me. Like I got Salinger's, someone gave me Salinger's 9 Stories, and that really did a number on me, kind of coming right out of college there. And but really, my first love was movies. Really, really wanted to be a filmmaker. That was
So
that
I happen
was
to have that book, Nine
yeah.
Stories, like right on my desk at the moment. It's
That's
interesting.
still one of my favorites of all time. 9 Stories. But yeah, I was really into movies, and so my first kind of writing projects, were screenplays, actually. So I was writing a lot of screenplays in my early 20s. And since I live in New Hampshire, about as far away from Hollywood as you could possibly be, that went nowhere. And some minor forays into trying independent stuff, but that also kind of didn't go anywhere either.
Yeah, and those formative years, I mean, let's talk about that time in the world, because it seems like that was probably before social media. That was before, a lot of what we think of the internet, the writing gets done on the internet. So it makes sense to me that you're talking about physical media here and books and movies as an experience of movie going. Could you talk a little bit about that moment in time that was, influential in your consuming media, if not creating it?
Yeah, yeah. Going to the theater a lot. You sort of had to go to the theater to see things. And I always had to wait for things to roll around. But if anything unusual popped up, it was always a big event. Like I remember us finally getting Virgin Suicides in 2000, and we're hearing about it. It had been at Cannes, I think, the year before. So it was a whole year of really hearing about this movie until it finally rolled around at like this really like indie kind of theater. Like it was almost a joke in my hometown because it was not like the multiplexes, you know. It was just this kind of almost old school. It looked like a playhouse or something with like a pillar in the middle that you kind of had to sit. You know, you didn't want the seat behind it, or you'd
Right.
have an obstructed view almost and stuff like that. So, and I remember another formative thing. I remember when Requiem for a Dream came out, and there was all this buzz behind it. And we actually traveled to the city, so it was a big event. Boston. It was playing at the Boston Film Festival that year, but we wanted to ensure that we'd be able to see this movie because there was no guarantee, you know, when we would ever be able to see it. Even on physical media, sometimes, you know, it just slipped through the cracks, and certainly there was no, you know, digital way of distributing those movies. So, yeah,
Yeah.
going to the theater was actually a big deal at the
Yeah.
time.
And I should say there is at least one of your stories in The Funeral Girl that is set in a movie theater, or it takes place largely in a movie theater. I'm thinking of
Yes,
Plain Jane.
yes, yes,
So I do want to talk a lot about your, I said earlier, I think of you mainly as a fiction writer. Is that how you think of yourself?
yes.
Okay.
And weirdly, I think of myself as a long form fiction writer, even though I don't have a lot to show for that. But
Okay.
it's the idea of myself,
Hmm.
and I hope to remedy that soon. But yeah, I tend to think in long form ways, and mainly fiction. I feel like I write fiction and the occasional essayish thing sometimes, basically.
And your book, The Funeral Girl, which had a new edition that I saw for the first time last year at the Gettysburg Conference. It has, I don't know how many stories in it, 15, 20 stories, something like that.
Something between 15 and 20,
20,
yeah.
something like that. And, I mentioned the title story, The Funeral Girl, which is pretty lengthy story. Um, and, mentioned that it has what I think are some Wallace homages, if not influences, with, the mention of David Letterman. Not the mention, I mean, it's pretty core to the story of
Yes,
the
yeah.
way the media itself is distributed and received. So let's talk a little bit about that story. What were you thinking when you wanted to tell that story?
Well, yeah, I remember pretty vividly that story in particular because I wrote that in 2009, and I was still completely shattered by what had happened the year before,
Mm-hmm.
basically, because by that time I was a huge Wallace fan, and the news completely blindsided me, and I was pretty almost depressed about it
Mm-hmm.
for about a year afterward, and a lot had to do selfishly with the thought that we would never read a new Wallace material ever again. And this was even before, I think, before D.T. Max's article in New Yorker came out.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't. I wasn't aware of the Pale King. There's this thing called Pale King that was going to come out. At least there would be that. So I just thought, I mean, in this despair, like, well, I am going to write this thing that, with everything I have, with all my writerly powers, I just kind of try to do my best version of what he would do. So with every word that was written in that story, it was written with the thought, like, well, what would Wallace have written here, sort of in a spirit of homage, but also just the way I dealt with his passing, essentially. That was my attempt at processing it.
Well, and I think some of the updating that you've done to his type of writing, is that he sort of died before, YouTube became big, before like viral videos on Twitter were a big thing. And your story kind of starts out with that premise of a viral video, and yet it's really about TV based. And that's sort of what you were describing earlier, is like the moment in time that you came of age in media was this transitional period from where we had grown up as kids with traditional TV. You had to just change the channel and see what was on. Everyone watched late night TV or everyone watched sitcoms, to now being adults where there's thousands of different streaming options. There's millions of different, media companies actively fighting for your attention. I feel like there's a lot of that sort of tension in the story. And how much of that was influenced by Wallace, but also your own experience.
It's interesting to think about that story now, because I mean, YouTube, I think, was created like 2005, 2006. So it'd been like 3 years that YouTube was out in the world even, and it wasn't really an entrenched sort of even thing yet. I mean, things going viral, the way things went viral back in the day, it's nothing compared to how it is now in a way. I mean, it seemed like that at the time. Like if the video was passed around, it did seem like everyone in your circle was watching it. But I mean, nothing like today, where it's just like there's so many areas of dissemination. But there's a collision of old and new media, and that seems kind of, I wrote it sort of a little ahead, so it takes place in the future from where I wrote it, and we're right around coming to where I
Right.
think the story ends
Right.
up. Like I think I was writing around 2020-ish, something like that. And I definitely get things wrong completely. So it's interesting to see what I got right and what I got wrong. But Letterman's almost the most interesting thing about that, because I never would have predicted Letterman would have had this kind of,
Staying power almost. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Like he's still a relevant cultural figure. I mean, due to the Netflix show, but
But even his influence on Conan and, other sort of people who are trying to keep his style alive. And I think, Wallace's interest in him was sort of mainstreaming irony, and this sort of collective shrug that people had towards, corporate culture and capitalism, and yet participating in it, obviously, by consuming the David Letterman show
yeah,
and all the celebrity guests and things. But I mean, the other piece of your story, I think that it fits with the collection, and maybe even why it's the title story is, the funeral girl. A lot of these stories are girls' names, right? We
yeah,
should say there's, I could go down the list, but there's Sarah, Melissa, Hannah, Lindsay, Stephanie, on and on and on. And even the ones that are not girls' names are like the funeral girls. There's Liquid Almond Eyes. There's other names for characters. And so I wanted to ask you about some of the other stories too. A lot of them are really about the relationship between men and women. There's a lot about sort of a chance meeting of a woman, often ending with a broken heart. And, I wanted to ask your interest in telling that story and how it's told in multiple sort of voices or characters.
yeah, yeah. Can I say just a
Yeah,
couple
go
more
ahead.
things about Funeral Girl?
Go,
Because
go,
I'm remembering it. It was written so long ago
go
that I'm
back.
trying to remember where I was in the
Sure, go
headspace.
ahead.
And you talking me reminded me of a couple of things. First of all, like I want to make clear, like I mean, Wallace obviously blows me away in every regard. Like I'm not trying to say like
You don't need
this
to
is in
belittle
any
yourself. And
way.
I'm not comparing, I'm not going to saying, oh, this is on par with a David Foster Wallace
Yeah,
story,
I mean,
but it is influenced by it. And I think it stands on its own in its own right. So don't belittle it too much for me here.
the other thing with Letterman, it reminded me like I was very aware of My Appearance, which is Wallace's Letterman story, and I remember I had read it and I didn't reread it before doing like my story. And I think my story, because we all know how like Wallace felt about irony and his criticisms of it. So I was thinking I would do my take on basically killing irony in the story, which is represented by Letterman. So taking it down essentially and doing my own criticism about Letterman's or irony as represented by Letterman. And it's interesting, after I read the story, going back to My Appearance, I mean, I feel that My Appearance is more a criticism of not so much of Letterman, but the people around Letterman and how they react to irony, because there's this girl going on Letterman in my appearance, and her boyfriend or her companion, or she's being coached on how to like successfully navigate the ironic waters of the Letterman show. And the way she's being coached is like, to me, just way more toxic. It's more like overthinking, or trying to cut off irony at the pass, and you're kind of killing yourself in a way by trying to kind of outthink it out of its own game. Whereas Letterman is just, he's a force of nature that's just gonna, what he's gonna do. So she's not gonna fool you in the same way that this girl is trying to be coached to fool everyone, if that makes any sense. But I just felt like my appearance rereading it was just much more a criticism on all the ways we try to sidestep irony and betray kind of our sensibilities and principles and ourselves in a way.
Yeah, I think, my appearance, you're right. It's a lot about that sort of media management, and maybe that seemed a little dated even by the time that story came out. He wrote that story in grad school in the 80s, and the idea now that a celebrity would go on a talk show and be sort of managed their appearance in a way to benefit them even better. He was sued later for this story because it was like almost verbatim an actual appearance, and in the character's name I think was Edelin. I was trying to forget that, but you're right that the message is a bit different. But I also feel like the Wallace is showing off in a way in that story that it's not one of his most beloved stories by many people, because there is not a lot of heart in it, and that it's really hard to do that when I feel like it is almost a critique of the reader. So it's a good point. Like, your story definitely is doing a different thing there with the sort of media filter between viewer and subject.
I was almost glad that they are different stories and they're trying to do different things. And again, you've warned me against this, but I do think his has a few more layers than mine. Mine is pretty simplistic, just kind of like, well, what ways can I take down Letterman? In what way could Letterman go down? And like you said, he's been remarkably resilient, like through cancel culture and through his style of media. He's somehow adapted it to current
Yeah.
day, and a way
Yeah.
I never foreseen. So I didn't foresee that. So.
And while we're talking about Wallace here, I'm curious now. I don't know if I've ever asked you this, which is, what was your experience like? You mentioned his death and the immediate aftermath there of it. Like, when did you become aware of like the online David Foster Wallace fan community and like following things? Like, was the first thing you landed on the Howling Fantods? Were you on the email list?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, it was just the Howling Fantods. I didn't get into like Wallace L or anything like that. I just knew, and that's another old school thing where you just went to a website every day. You went to the homepage of the website.
Yep.
And I remember just checking out if there was new news, and sending Nick, who ran it. Is it
He's
still?
still around. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, little tidbits. See, it's like, oh, did you see this Wallace reference in this movie and stuff like that? And
As I mentioned, your story and many of the stories in the book are really about the relationship between men and women. They're about love. They're often about early relationships, early on, of, like I say, either chance meetings or meeting someone, and how fraught that can be.
yeah,
So, I'm pretty sure I'm correct that this is a very strong interest that you have in inspiring your writing. Is that fair to say?
yes, that's
Okay.
very fair. So where that came from, it's interesting because I'm writing one of the essays in the essay collection. It's called 1997. It's unfinished at this point, because I've built it up so much in a way that it's become almost like my origin story. So I keep adding to it and trying to make it as perfect as I can. But it really charts sort of where that comes from. And I'll just frame it in a way that it's probably going to sound cheesy initially, but I think I can explain it. So in 1997, like it was a big year because I graduated high school, and I was really getting into movies that year, and so seeing almost everything. And one movie in particular, I mean, everyone could probably guess, but 1997. But Titanic came out in 1997, and everyone was blown away by this movie. If you bought into it, it was the biggest movie, the most expensive movie of all time, and to see, I was an 18-year-old kid. I mean, that I was thinking about girls all the time anyway. So to see this movie kind of do a central, like, to have at its core a central love story in a big way, and they spent $200 million on it. All these adults and all these artists, spending all this time and money for basically just a boy and girl story was kind of like amazing to me. And then to have it go on and win all these awards and get all this money and have real world effect. I mean, that movie dominated the culture for a year plus,
It was
which
a
is
little
another.
more than a boy girl story, but at the core of it, I mean, maybe that was even a criticism of some people. Like that's how it was successful, is they took
Yeah.
a love story and sort of grafted it onto this, huge historical event that obviously James Cameron wanted to recreate. But yeah, I remember everyone had the VHS when it came out. It was the two VHS sleeve, like you'd see that if anyone went to Walmart in the like 1997, 98, they had the Titanic VHS. Absolutely. People saw it multiple times in the theaters. It was like a 3-hour movie, right? Or huge phenomenon to say the least.
Yeah.
And Kate Winslet was great in it. There is a piece in, maybe it's actually in your letters to Jonathan Franzen where you talk about Kate Winslet and
We do
how
talk about Kate Winslet a little.
actually she was great in Titanic. So I think most people would agree with you that a lot of the success of that movie was those two lead actors putting on performance of a lifetime.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to me to hear you say that was an inspiring thing, but I get it now to say that could be enough to drive a lot of success, is a really good mainstream love story.
Yeah, for a kid that didn't know what he wanted to do with his life. I mean, this big comet came out of the sky and just obliterated everything, and just really showed me that. I mean, I didn't even think about being an artist really. And then you got James Cameron being front and center, he wrote this and directed it and made this essentially. And then Oscar night happened, and we're all, giving them gold trophies for it, and it was just it showed me that you could not only make a living doing art, but yeah, you could be celebrated
You could
for
be
it.
wildly successful.
Exactly. You can
Yeah.
make like money, and it made money for lots of people. And so uh, there was that aspect of it. And you're right. I am distilling it. There's a lot more to the movie, obviously. But I mean, that was kind of what grabbed me,
Mm-hmm.
certainly at the time. It was in line with a lot of kind of what I was interested in when I was thinking. And then that really, not only that, but that in combination, and I didn't even realize this before sort of writing or getting into this essay that I was writing, when I was like, you know what, it wasn't just that. It was another movie that came out this same year, and I must have seen it sometime within 6 months of seeing Titanic, but there was a movie called In the Company of Men by Neil Labute. And he's a guy that people don't really talk about much anymore, but it was an independent movie. It was his first movie. It was the first time anyone had heard of this guy. And if anyone's seen that movie, that is a they want to make that movie today, basically. I don't know if you're familiar with that one.
I remember seeing it when I was in college, and that was long. Haven't not seen it since. I mean, what I remember, Neil Labute was definitely popular amongst like the film studies crowd. And so it was like, oh, this is an important thing. And like, I also saw this before I had ever had like an office job or like a real sort of important long-term relationship. Um, so I was like, maybe not the ideal audience for the movie.
I mean, a lot of it was over my head too. It was a bunch of maybe adulting or whatever you
Mm-hmm.
want to call it. I mean, not that people do what they did in these movies, but it was what it showed me was, I mean, it is also about a movie. In the Company of Men is about a movie about men and women, also in its way, but very that the opposite side of the spectrum. If you want to talk about like Titanic represents sort of like the ideal like romantic side of that, the possibilities of romantic interaction with men and women. And the Company of Men is just
The
them going at
opposite.
each other's throats,
Right.
basically.
Right.
Yeah, the war break basically between men and women. And between those two movies and seeing them in the same year, it was like, wow, I'm seeing the whole spectrum of what you could do just with stories with just men and women, and I think that really kind of instilled itself in me, where it's just like, oh, you can just do stories like this and you can basically do anything. And since then it's been replaced by sort of better examples for me. Like I would say I would replace the Titanic end of the spectrum with like the Before trilogy or something, where it's a more like deeper layered sort of picture of where romantic love can lead. And then in the Company Men, I would replace by probably the person Labute was ripping off to begin with was David Mamet's Oleana is really kind of the
It's
best example
quintessential.
of that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Of the of kind of how they can be at each other's throats in various ways. So between that, it's just like, yeah, I mean, you can do anything you want. And as I got into literature, you know, I started reading these people who were tackling stories like that, like Updike and Roth, and so like I was attracted to what they were doing and reading that. And I mean, talk about a different time period. I mean, I don't see that being done so much anymore, and that's really, I mean, this ties into why I'm continuing to do it now. I think if Updike were still a major cultural figure doing stories like that, I'm not sure I'd even attempt to do it. But since I don't have that, you know, because he could do it much better than I could anyway. So
Okay. Now there's a lot of directions we can go, Don,
yeah,
because I'm a bit.
sorry I threw a lot
No,
out
no.
there, but
I'm glad you did because you opened up a bunch of avenues here, and that I'm huge Updike fan. Although I'm not an apologetic for him, and I don't love everything that he did, I think he's still one of the best at what he did. And I love the Before trilogy. I think it's a great thing to bring up, and you and I have talked about it before. And I would love to talk about it a bit more, but I want to ask you because we did briefly mention Franzen in relationship to um, Kate Winslet, and that you not only have some letters you have written to Franzen in your collection of letters, but also on the front cover of the new edition of The Funeral Girl is a blurb from Jonathan Franzen, which is pretty unique. Not a lot of people see that. Um, as you know, I have different opinions about his work, and I'm not a huge Franzen fan. And I think it's totally okay that you are, as is Kimmy. I know both of you are friends and supporters and are fans of his. And I'm not going to ask you to defend it because I don't think it needs defending. Like it's like millions of copies sold defends it. But I think it's interesting that you didn't mention him in terms of people who are, like, oh, if Updike were alive and doing this now, maybe Franz is doing something more about family structures and about, you know, uh, similar sort of realistic storytelling, what I would call realistic storytelling, but with a different heart behind it, which is not necessarily that romantic or anti-romantic slant. Is that your take?
yeah, Franz's work always seemed to me more about the whole family thing. He's he's denied that in interesting ways, but I think there's well, what he denies mainly is like he calls Crossroads, which is his latest novel, his first family novel. But people would argue he's been writing family novels for a while. He has his own specific definition of it, so it makes sense. But yeah, you're right. I think when I think of him, I think of family dynamics. And if you, I've just talked about this with somebody like recently. Just if you look at my work, there's I don't know how conspicuous it is, but there's a real absence of family dynamic in my work. I've never really tackled it as far as I can recall.
Nope, I don't.
And
Can't think of a single story in yours that's about that, really.
yeah, so him as an influence is, I mean, in terms of content, at least, really didn't play into. I've been a fan of his though for even before Wallace. I want to say it's kind of fuzzy, but I think I read him for the first time like 2004, and I had no idea about. I don't know when we were aware that Wallace and him were friends. Do you like
Yeah,
remember?
it's an interesting question. I think it was mentioned in, in a couple of interviews, but it was never made a big deal of until after he died.
Okay,
Um, so I
that's what I
think
thought
I
too.
think your idea of that tracks. It's not like they were doing a ton of public events together or talking about each other much publicly. But maybe I'm wrong. I mean, they were on Charlie Rose together, but you didn't think of them as like, oh, they're best friends or something. And
Yeah, more like literary acquaintances or
right,
whatever. But yeah, so and plus I was unaware of the controversy. I was so when I first started getting into literature, that's when I was getting into kind of contemporary literature. I mean, I was almost I think I was pretty ignorant even of the Oprah thing at the time. So I just knew like kind of, oh, Corrections is this book that everyone, it even pierced my sort of like cinema centric bubble.
it was a big deal. I won the National Book Award. It was on the cover of all of the major
Yeah,
trade publications, and I mean, Oprah. They made a huge deal of it. So
yeah.
I'm not surprised by that. And the fact that I'm assuming you wrote him a fan letter first, and then he wrote back, and then you started corresponding after that. Is that about right?
Yep, that's what happened exactly. I wrote him in 2019, and it was toward the end of that, and I didn't hear anything back for 6 months, and I had forgotten that I'd even sent him anything, and then I got a postcard in the mail saying like, sorry, I've been working on finishing this book for the last 6 months, and I can't really correspond when I'm doing that. But I've been, I had your letter in the back of my mind all the time. So first thing, I just
Wow.
turned in the book, and I'm popping this postcard in the mail, and that was amazing to receive. And we pretty quickly switched to email after that. But yeah, we've been regularly,
Wow.
periodically shooting each other emails ever since.
And I should say in the collection of letters, there is called All the Best Collected Correspondence. The book is out now or is coming out in 2024. Is that correct?
It's out now technically.
Okay.
You can buy it if you wanted.
Okay. All right. I have read the book and enjoyed it. And there are letters also to, oh, I should say all the letters are your side of the correspondence.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it,
I'm not
it,
not
it
yeah.
it doesn't have letters from Franzen in here. They're all
No,
letters
no.
to Franzen, but also a handful of the same to Alexander Theroux and more to Brandon Hobson and some other writers included as well. Do you want to talk about either one of those of writing to um, Theroux or Brandon Hobson? It looks like you first encountered online. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. The
Yeah.
same way I did with you, I think. I mean, he was part of the like Wallace community online. I'm pretty sure that's how we started talking. And this was like 2015-ish. And right about that time, he was about to publish a book called Desolation of Avenues Untold, which I know, we both love. Um, and he was like, "Oh, you want to see a digital galley of that?" And I was like, "Of course, yeah. Any Wallace fan, I'm interested in seeing what they come up with." And yeah, so that was how that started. And ever since we,
Yeah. So the Wallace connection there is interesting because Brandon, I'd first heard of back in like 1999, 2000, and he sent me a letter that he had written to Wallace that Wallace had written back when he had written to Wallace when before Infinite Jest was published, which was pretty rare that people were doing that. but Wallace, of course, wrote everyone back, and I remember I was living in New York at the time, and Brandon faxed me a copy of that letter, which is how
Hmm.
old it is. And now the original of it is in the Ransom Center.
I've seen that.
Yeah, you've seen that because you came to Austin in 2022 for the conference, which was, the first time that you and I met, and then did a reading together last year at the Wallace conference in Gettysburg. And a lot of these letters sort of stem from that. I wanted to ask you about, like, I'm obviously biased, a big advocate of the Wallace conference, not only the Wallace community online, but in real life, which you've seen both sides of the coin now. You're one of the few people I could talk to about this who has seen it online for years, but it's a pretty different beast in person, and in good way. I really believe in that, from my outsider perspective, that was the first time I'd met you in person last year, and it looked like had a pretty big impact on you, Don. Yeah. Describe your experience. I want to hear from your point of view what that was like coming to Austin.
I'll say really quick, because you asked about Theroux too, that the Theroux correspondence started out the same way. Just a huge fan of his stuff, so mailed him a fan letter and got something back from him. And so, but he really doesn't email with me, so it's just kind of like physical. Like I send him kind of physical letters, and he sends postcards. That's basically the nature of our correspondence. But he's been really generous and gracious too. They're also, I don't like, they're not whatever persona they have in the literary community, and both Franzen and Theroux do have a certain reputation, I think, among certain people. Like they've just been amazingly generous with their time and their words in correspondence to me anyway. So but anyway, so yeah, I went to Austin for the first time 2 years ago to go to the 2022 conference. I was supposed to go to the 2020 conference, like a lot of people, but that fell through, of course. And I'd always meant to go ever since the Ransom Center got the Wallace archives in 2011.
I think it opened in 2010. Yeah.
2010. Okay. Yeah. As soon as I heard about it, I was like, I need to get to Austin someday. So I thought the conference was an opportunity to do that and get over my fears of flying and all that stuff and getting out of my room a little. And but I was like really nervous because meeting these people are in real life, like you and a couple others. I've only had online interactions with all of you, so I was really nervous about meeting you. But you made things amazingly easy and smooth as soon as I saw you. You're like, Don, you're great, I'm so glad you came, and a big hug and everything. You made the weekend amazing. And meeting the people, everyone was just consistently just amazing and engaging, and just everything coming out of everyone's mouth was funny, smart, insightful, everything, just the whole weekend with everyone. And
all right, I don't need you to kiss my butt much
I'm
more,
just saying,
but
I could go on and on about the
but
conference.
I'm bringing it up partly because you're in your book of letters.
Yeah.
There's some correspondence that you and I have had, but also from Milena and Yarek, who I don't, you didn't know before you got there, and Tim Person, and like these are people whom I'm assuming you met for the first time at that weekend. And I got to say, like, I am really happy that weekend went well for you and went well for everyone. And like after the delay of COVID and not being able to be together in person, like it meant a lot more. I think people were very generous because also they had been deprived of this sort of in-person interaction for a couple of years. And so that was, that feeling to me would be hard to replicate without going through another pandemic, which no one wants to do. But it's one thing for me to feel those things whenever I'm in this sort of community that we've found amongst the literary world, which can be really elitist and exclusionary and things. But then to hear other people say the same sorts of things is very like life affirming for me. So that's part of why I wanted you to do that. One of your other correspondents in the book I have to mention too is Carol DeChillis Hill. And you turned me onto her book, which was called, she's got a couple of books, but the one that you gave to me, which I was really impressed by, is Jeremiah 8:20. and I'd never heard of this book. I'm always looking for books that other people think are great that I've not only not read but not heard of. So when you told me, "Oh, do you know Carol de Chillis Hill?" I was like, "No, I do not." And I would say most people would say, "No, I do not." Maybe her books are even out of print now. But tell us a little bit. One, how did you discover her, and then decide to write to her?
Yeah, that's pretty straightforward. I was reading a lot of David Foster Wallace interviews, as one does, just going through everything. And he was on a press tour for, I think, a supposedly fun thing, and he stopped over in Minnesota, and this reporter working for this random Minnesotan newspaper interviewed him, and in the little preamble before the interview, he said, he was just cluing readers into the kind of writer Wallace was, and he was like, yeah, he's like William T. Volman, he's like Richard Powers, he's like Carol Cheliceau. And I'm like, wait a second.
One of those does not fit in.
No one has ever said that before, ever. I've read all the interviews, so I had to check that out immediately. And yeah, you're right. Her books are sort of out of print now, but they're pretty easy to get copies of. So and she doesn't have a lot. She has four, technically five novels, but one is she weirdly wrote the the novelization of the movie An Unmarried Woman, a Paul Mazursky film that's now available on Criterion, but four novels of her own, and that's basically her entire corpus, scattered short stories here or there. But over the course of, let's see, Jeremiah 20 was written in 1970. Her last novel was Henry James' Midnight Song in 1993, and she has not published or, as far as I can tell, written anything since.
And she's still alive, right? She's still alive.
She's still alive. She's actually a pretty public figure because she ended up marrying someone who owns, oh geez, I think he owned Astroland in Coney Island.
Wow.
So like she lives a different life than
Just
post 93.
just
You
being
know,
a writer is not her full time job, I would say.
yeah, and they ended up. I don't know. There's a lot of drama with that. You can read, Google that, and lots of things come up that I wasn't really that interested in. I was just kind of trying to determine if she's written anything. But yeah. So I read all the stuff, and I did a big blog post on her. As far as I can tell, it's still sort of the most comprehensive kind of thing on the internet about her. Kind of compiled all this biographical data on her that I could, and little mini reviews of her books. And I ended up finding her phone number and just cold calling her and being
Wow.
like, "Hey, what's up?" And we had like a 20-minute conversation. She is a private person in her own way. She didn't have any real interest in kind of rehashing her literary career, but was pleasant and said it's nice to know that you enjoyed the books.
Well, in your essay, I should say, is also included. The essay on Carol de Chillis Hill is included in your collection. The exact right word, which we haven't talked a ton about, but it's a book that I also love. And initially, I was thinking I would compare it to Chuck Klosterman because of your interest in like a lot of pop culture stuff. There's an essay on Lena Dunham's Girls. There's an essay on Paul Thomas Anderson. There's an essay on Taylor Swift. One on David Foster Wallace. One on the Steve Jobs biography. A little short one about Harry Potter. So, like, tell us a little bit about, is this sort of a representation of your mind in terms of movies, books, and culture, or is this, you said something earlier about like you're not really a nonfiction writer.
Yeah, I mean, emphasis on short pieces. Most of them are pretty short little pieces, and most of them are written around a certain time when I was trying to see if this this blog thing could take off or something. So you had to kind of generate content, and a lot of it was content generated for sort of a semi-daily kind of blog situation. So it forced me to kind of come up with things to write about. So I was like just looking around and seeing what was coming out and things in newspapers, stuff like that. But the pages added up enough to kind of collect them, and they kind of work together that way.
Yeah, and in some of them, I think you've reworked, into most of them I would say are not blog posts, are reworked into to short essays. But let's talk about your, I mean, your sustained interest in some of these topics, especially Taylor Swift and Paul Thomas Anderson. So we agree on both of these points. So I think our only main disagreement point here is on Jonathan Franzen. But um, I personally love the work of Taylor Swift and have like, but I haven't studied it in depth. To say, I would say or even ranked it as much in my head as you have sort of ranked it. So we just got a new Taylor Swift double album this month. What do you make of it? How do you rank it in comparison to some of her other stuff?
Well, she's doing the artist thing where it's like, for me, where that's, and this is sort of how I can tell if someone's a true artist, where they come out with a thing and you are not even, you're sort of not equipped enough to kind of immediately understand it. You kind of have to live with it, and sometimes you have the completely wrong idea about it. We've all had the experience of something coming out and you're like, oh, that sucks,
Mm-hmm.
and then cut to a year, 2, 5, 10 years later, and it's like, oh, that's my favorite thing ever.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the mark of I mean, in the previous examples I can think of is when like Kubrick films came out and stuff. I mean, people talk about that like, people hated 2001 when it came out, and then suddenly it's the best thing ever. There's been this renaissance or something, this reevaluation of Eyes Wide Shut, which is a movie I loved when it first came out. Like as
For
soon as I
sure.
saw it, I mean, as I mean, talk about men and women. I mean, just that's one of the great
Right.
stories tackling that subject in cinema. Taylor's the same way. Some like it took me even up till now to appreciate her previous album, Midnight's. Like I didn't think that was very good. I remember talking with someone at the time when it first came out. I'm like, I would put this in the bottom half of her discography there. And now I would say it competes. I don't know how high it gets, but it competes for probably third best in my
Wow.
list. So, and this I'm trying to, because this one's a little weird. There's no real big, top 40 hit on this one, I don't think. Um, and she's kind of doing what I kind of hoped she would concentrate on, which is more, really, really digging into, lyrical poetry without so much emphasis on pop hits or production. And we'll see if I end up forgetting what I wish for there a little. Be careful.
Well, I definitely would not have thought to compare her to Stanley Kubrick, but
Yeah,
I got to
yeah.
say, an interesting thing about that is his films changed pretty radically from film to film,
Mm.
and that he did Lolita, he did The Shining, he did uh, what's the Vietnam one, the
Full Metal Jacket.
Full Metal Jacket, and 2001. They're all different sort of genres, and she's also a person who has recorded albums in completely different genres and has sort of reinvented her style from album to album. And so I think, I'm not saying it's a bad comparison, because I do think she's trying to do something interesting each time out, and there's a lot of pressure to perform on that. Like it's got to be unimaginable to say this album better be good, better have a top 40 hit on it, it better, but it's going to be streamed. I mean, it's part of the market now. Like it's going to be streamed relentlessly by people who are looking for meaning in it, for people who are looking for it to stick in some way in their brain. And some of those songs take more than one or two listens to even remember how it goes. So it's an interesting comparison, Don.
Like I've listened to her since 2007. I remember when I first started listening to her. I made a little mix CD when we burned CDs at the time for people that Christmas, and put her at the very top. And people were saying, "Who's Taylor Swift?" From people, people from 20 to 65 were at this party, and everyone down the line. But public reaction, it's always interesting, and I think you might think the same way, where it's just like they're coming in with these takes, and you think this is the one, oh, this is the one they'll hate, but the reaction to the new one has been overwhelmingly positive from people, from just casual listeners. So that's been surprising
Yeah.
to me. Just randomly, I think of like John Franzen's latest novel, Crossroads. I thought that would be the one that people really dug their claws into, but that's he got better reviews on that one, it seemingly than ever before. It was just weird to me. Not that I didn't like it, but I just thought this is the one. If you're going to criticize them for anything, if you're really out to get them, this is the one to do it with, because it's really stripped down and just not, there's not as much pyrotechnics as the other novels that you can kind of grab onto.
I think, maybe some of that fireworks had been expended on freedom and purity, and not a lot of it was left. By the time you get to Crossroads, those people were sort of, I don't know, anti-Franzen out by that point. I don't know.
Mm.
But now that you mentioned Franzen, brings us back to the Book of Letters. I wanted to ask you if you had one to read from to give us a sense of what the book sounds like, and also sort of your voice when it's in correspondence form.
Yeah, thank you for giving me the opportunity to do this, because I think when you hear a correspondence collection, especially from someone who's like not,
super well known.
Exactly. You think, why? What's the point? A little, but just to give you a taste of what they're like. So I'm trying to pick a fairly representative paragraph from one. This is something I wrote to Franzen in December 21st of last year. I too want to do a lot more reading in 2024. Even though I'm surrounded by big stacks of new to me books, I spent the last couple months rereading Flannery O'Connor. I plowed through all her stories again, and it was a real pleasure. I think she had the best kind of influence on my work, the kind I was not even cognizant of. I admire her precision, her ear for dialogue, and what seems like a rule-breaking intentionality. It's hard not to think that some of these stories were written from the final line backward, considering how all the elements click perfectly, and sometimes improbably, into place. But no matter how clockwork-like her stories are, the characters never seem like mere cogs. They are, to a one, vivid and real and memorable. That's her magic trick, to be simultaneously calculated and natural, and the way she has her cake and eats it too causes no small amount of envy, at least to someone like me, who used to treat his characters like chess pieces more often than I care to admit. I did read Wise Blood for the first time, and I'm currently in the middle of Violent Bear It Away. Wise Blood is great, so darkly funny and deeply spiritual. For as many indictments that her work contains about the institutions of religion and the people who exploit spirituality for personal gain, her belief and respect and awe in, for, and at a higher power shine through, even for non-believers like me. Her depictions of reprobates, narcissists, and con men give the impression that there's an unsullied and pure salvation that lies beyond their reach, and rightly so. I found myself thinking not that her spiritually bereft characters needed religion, but that I wanted to protect religion from them. Quite a thing to motivate an atheist to think. And really, that's sort of like a lot of our back and forth. We just talk about other people's stuff. Like, I give my opinion about stuff, and he gives his opinions back. But that's a lot of what's contained in here, where it's just like, it's not so much personal stuff or what I'm up to kind of in my day to day. It's more like, okay, well, who do you want to tackle today? What should we talk?
Well, that thing about Flannery O'Connor, I think, is a great writer's question. My paper last year at the conference was about Flannery O'Connor and thinking about her stories, in particular, how they sort of click together like that. I think, the reason why a lot of people don't write that style anymore is it's really difficult. Salinger too. I'm thinking some of those stories from Nine Stories, just how perfectly crafted they are. Like, your description there is great, like almost written from the last line backwards, like clockwork. His stories also work like that for me. And I think, there are writers who don't do that, not because they don't want to, but because they can't, because it's really difficult. And it's a lot, I wouldn't say sloppier or lazier or easier to sort of break a form that you haven't mastered. And, she was clearly a master of that form, and yet it feels groundbreaking in a way. So I think you really nailed it there. And that's, one of Franzen's blurb for your work is really about nailing it and accuracy. And that's why I wanted to ask you about realism in fiction? Like, do you consider yourself a realist? A lot of these stories, I would say, are pretty realistic. Maybe not the funeral girl itself. Like, you can do both realistic. I mean, Franzen I would consider to be a realistic writer for the most part. Same with Salinger. Like, he's not doing science fiction. He's not doing, pure romance. He's doing realistic literary fiction. So, like, what does that mean to you, realistic?
I think what Wallace said about it once really resonates with me, where someone asked him the same question essentially, and he was like, he doesn't know too many writers that don't consider themselves realists in a way. You kind of have to. I mean, I do myself, and outside of the school of realism, I guess there's a whole writing school of it. So that has more to do with style than anything. But yeah, I think like when I'm writing stories, it's rooted in the real world, if that's how we want to define it. It's definitely rooted in kind of real world experience and my experience of how it's the world is hitting me. So in that respect, I don't think I'm running outside of that at all. Another one thing I'll say about Funeral World too is like this for the most part the stories written in that time period were written like the way I described it to someone, I think even in a letter, was like I feel like what I was doing was as if like Wallace were writing like Updike like New Yorker stories, and that sort of was the concept behind everything, like doing a maximalist overlay over, like I wanted to do sort of Updike like stories, which is very realistic, very rooted in that, to the point where he's transcribing conversations sometimes and putting making them short stories.
Yeah, I was actually just reading the new introduction to Adam Levine's The Instructions by Gabriel Bump, who wrote the new introduction, and he talks about taking a class with Adam Levine, and he was trying to be a very realistic writer and like thinking, okay, these two characters are in a room. Realistically, what's the next thing that they would do? What's the next thing that they would say? What move makes the most real sense to the reader? And he said Adam Levine encouraged him to not say what's the most realistic thing, but what's the most interesting move. And that's different than being a realist in my mind. And like
Gotcha.
I would say Adam Levine is not a realist.
Gotcha.
And he's writing a sort of, I don't know, speculative fiction in some ways. A lot of his stuff is more of an imaginative quality. And I wanted to ask you, because you told me one time when we were talking about this that, if you could craft stories with like holograms in a way, it would be almost more realistic. Like if you could make these things appear, we've talked about some writer directors who are able to not only write a story, but then make it come to life on a screen and direct it. Like you started out as a film guy because do you think some of it was because you could make those stories come to life in a more realized way?
That pretty much nails it. Yeah, like I'm definitely an audio visual sort of person,
Mm-hmm.
like naturally. So the big disappointment, of course, is that you need all these resources to create those images in the way that is satisfactory for you.
Right.
So it's when I turned to kind of straight prose writing, it was a relief to be free of those constraints. But obviously, there's whole new ones with writing and creating things with just words that I never really like. I enjoyed it too much to think too much about it, to be honest. Just creating sentences still is a pleasure, and when I can usually get it good enough that I can be satisfied with it, at least on the day.
Well, you should be happy with that because not most people can't even do that. So, um, and you and I have also talked a lot about graphic novels because I feel like the graphic novelists that I love are people who are able to write their own stories and illustrate it. And those to me are the most talented, most successful, most interesting writers. Chris Ware. I'm reading Sammy Harkham's new book, Blood of the Virgin, right now, which is fantastic. And it's the same approach where a writer sort of has a vision and is able to map out a story, but then also bring it to life in a visual way that, is different. I'm not saying it's better or worse than what a, pure fiction writer does, but like I see the appeal of it, as not only as a reader, but as a creator, as someone who's a writer, of being able to write a screenplay like a Wes Anderson character and then bring it to complete realism, have this vision in your head. That is the role of the director, to have the vision of what it's going to look like in its final form. So I'm just saying I agree with this is a long-winded way of saying I agree with you. We've covered a lot of territory. Like I say, I could easily go back and pick any one of these stories and do a deeper dive into. Same with the essays, same with the letters that are out now, which is called All the Best.
And if you're going to the conference, there'll be copies
Okay.
of these. So if you're interested at all in going to the conference, there'll be plenty of copies that'll probably be given away. So,
Well, let's not say that yet, Don. You still got to feed your own self. So money is a thing. I would be happy to pay for them, and I'm sure other people would be too, to get a signed copy. Don will be reading at the 2024 David Foster Wallace Conference in Austin. You can visit our website, dfwsociety.org, to learn more about the conference, and the details are all there on our website. So please do come see Don read and get a book signed if you're in Austin, June 6th, 7th, or 8th. You'll be there all 3 days of the conference, and more probably. So please come and see Don in Austin, and we will also let people know in the show notes or in our social media if you have other events or writings and new books coming out. All of those things keep us updated. I wanted to ask you, Don, if you had any final thoughts before we go.
I guess just the final thought of like, or just you talking about the difference between this the realism and non kind of clarified it for me. I think of like one of my favorite writers, Mamet, said like the point of like creating the point is not to write a scene of two people. The scene you saw of two people talking on a bus that morning. The point is to do something better than that. So there are definitely kind of schools of thought on that. I think I'm leaning more and more toward kind of traditional realism and what like I'm compiling notes for the next novel and kind of generating pages here and there, and they seem to be like a sentence. What is the most kind of logical thing that can happen next? It's something that doesn't stop a reader and be like, that's kind of highly unusual. And it's just nothing's better or worse. It's just kind of what you're turned on by. And a lot of the writers that I'm responding to lately seem to be writing in that mode. And one name I'll probably throw out in the bonus section too, but we'll throw her out here too, is Joanne Beard's Festival Days. I've given people, as many people as I can, this copy. Probably, I think I gave you a
Yep.
copy too.
Yep. I love that book.
But she definitely just tries to imagine so fully a world that exists in our world, and and to the point where it's almost there's no difference between fiction and nonfiction. And that collection does not make a distinction. There are fiction pieces in that, but you don't know which ones they are, and she makes no indication of it, which would horrify the purists. But on a it's exciting on a stylistic level for a writer to realize that, wow, you can kind of do that. And I understand where she's coming from, like to realize the world so vividly. That's sort of what I'm most interested in, instead of trying to dazzle with every sentence, or trying to keep readers engaged in that way, because I think the other way can be engaging if you really go for it, and really it's a different sort of engagement, obviously. But I think someone like Joanne Beard, it's hard to explain, but when you read someone like her, it really crystallizes for you, like, oh, that's definitely a direction to go in.
Well, I love that line by Mamet. That is great about your job is to do better than reality,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
I,
yeah.
and I find that really inspiring. He's also someone whose archives are in the Ransom Center, so
Yes,
please come
yes.
come to Austin.
It's an amazing place.
Look at the Wallace archive in the Ransom Center. Also, I have to put a plug in. We will have Joy Williams at the conference, and some of her letters to Don DeLillo are in the DeLillo archive at the Ransom Center. And let's tell people where they can find more of your work. If they want to follow you on Twitter, what is your Twitter handle for?
Most of my online engagement is over Twitter these days. The Twitter handle is DH Sayer, which is a pseudonym I was using, in 2011 when I formed the account. I know you can change your name, but I can't be bothered to do it at this point. So I'll just rock it with that. It's not a very interesting story. So we'll just leave it at that. DH Sayer at Twitter, whatever, at
Great.
Twitter.
We'll put a link to it in the show notes. And Don, I want to thank you for joining us here today on the Concavity Show. It's been a great pleasure to speak with you. And I hope that, people who haven't heard of The Funeral Girl or read it yet, go and pick that out first. And also find their way to your book of essays and your book of letters. I'm a big fan of letters collections. I have a ton of them here. I was reading actually Hemingway's selected letters, 1917 to 1961, just the other day. Love that. So I'm a big fan. I enjoyed reading the collection that you had. If people want to keep up with Dave and I and what we are still doing called the Concavity Show, you can follow us on Twitter at Concavity Show, on Instagram at Concavity Show, and on patreon.com/Concavity Show, where the highest mega novelist tier unlocks you some bonus episodes. So there will be, waiting for our Patreon listeners, a bonus episode with Don Hough after this episode comes out. So thanks again for your time today, Don, and we will talk to you soon.
Thank you, Matt. Honor and a pleasure.
Kept repeating